Hello, guys, and welcome back to another episode of Crooked Illness. Today, we are going to be getting into what it means to forgive ourselves and others and the power in doing that. Here to join me in this conversation is my guest, Kevin Clark. Kevin has found deep purpose through his work in the behavioral health field, specializing in treating addiction and trauma. He holds a degree in psychology and has been on his own path of awakening since 2005, getting sober and entering recovery in 2006. He also founded here, how do you say that?
Excelsior.
Excelsior. Yes. Okay. He founded Excelsior Addiction Services in 2020. He is also the author of The New Prophet, which we will talk about today. So without further ado, welcome Kevin to the podcast.
Hi, Paris. Thanks for having me.
Hey, Kevin. Thank you for coming on today. We beat that little technical difficulty and made it happen today. I'm excited to chat with you, not only about the book, about your recovery and all that stuff, but we're going to have a really good conversation as well on forgiveness, what that means, and what that looks like. So I would love to hear from you. What does forgiveness mean to you?
So, in the book, I have a line that I think sums it up pretty good, and it's talking about it's an integration and release of the negative charge embedded in the body in charge of the mind. So, to me, forgiveness is much more about the person carrying the pain and carrying the hurt, carrying the anger, the resentment, than it is if that person's someone else. And then, of course, there's self-forgiveness too. So it's just setting yourself free from hurt that you don't have to carry anymore. It doesn't excuse, unexcusable behavior or unacceptable behavior. It doesn't make that okay. It doesn't mean I invite that person back into my life. Again, if it's self-forgiveness, I better figure out a way to invite
Yeah.
myself back into my life. But yeah, I mean, I think it's more about healing and letting go than it is like just like a giving someone permission sort of
Mm-hmm.
thing.
Yeah, I love how last time we were talking, you brought up the point of freedom with that freedom and forgiveness, setting yourself free from what you're carrying and not really allowing that. So basically, not really allowing forgiveness to mean that happening is okay. Like saying that's fine, that happened, or it's okay, but you letting that go in order for yourself to move forward in your life and to continue on in a good state of mind or in a good place. I like how you brought, that the freedom part of it tied to that, tied to forgiveness and really setting yourself free from what you are either holding on to whatever happened, to whatever went on. And I also like how you relate that back to yourself as well, forgiving yourself. And like you mentioned, you in doing that, the process in doing that and what that looks like, is definitely challenging. It's not always something that's super easy, super simple to make happen, but I do like how you describe that in the book and, your experience with that. So I'd love to hear from you, if you could tell me what inspired you to write your book, The New Prophet, and what messages were you hoping to convey through the book?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Anyone that's read The Prophet by Khalil Gibran, he's a Lebanese American poet. It was published in 1928. It's pretty much, there's different excerpts on different aspects of life: marriage, children, prison, buying and selling, eating and drinking. And I look at it as it's almost spiritual wisdom in a in poetry through like the use of metaphor to just kind of help you look at these things that are part of your everyday life, but gives you a different perspective on them. Now, in 1928, the world was a lot different in a lot of ways than it is now, and I wanted to write something a little bit more modernized, little bit easier for people today to read. And also, more and more, like just like this podcast is all about, destigmatizing mental health uh, concerns and issues, and promoting emotional awareness and emotional vulnerability. I think that we're in a place in this country and in this world where, you know, and I mentioned in the book, like the age of ego crumbles, and I think that is where we're at, and I think we need to step into, the emotional beings, which is what makes us human and which is awesome.
Yeah,
So
and
that's what inspired it. And I'm a therapist, so I'm always working with feelings, like in my own journey and like with other people. And I used to write poetry, so and I've always been a fan of the metaphor as a teaching tool. So I use a lot of those in there.
yeah, that's awesome. I didn't know you were a therapist, so that's awesome to learn that and see. What I also like about the point you brought up of destigmatizing health, mental illness related issues and things like that is how you really organize the layout of the book, because I like how you talked about, making it more simpler to read than the one that you got inspired by, The Prophet, that book, and which was written in 1928, and you kind of basically take that story and bring up, I like how the chapters are laid out. They're like, you have ones on recovery, service, addiction, being human, perfectionism, and all these different things and different issues that people, have faced at some point in their life, or know somebody who has struggled with one of these things. And you really break it down in a sort of like simple conversation between a father and a son. And also, I really love how you talk a lot about self-love, and how does that relate to forgiveness? What is the relationship like between those two things? So for you, I'd love to know, like, what has it been like for you learning how to practice self-love and feel good about that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, self love has been, I think the idea of a spiritual awakening is it has these different levels. And I think when I finally fell in love with myself, um, it was just, I was so much more at peace in my own skin, and able to allow myself to feel the not so pleasant feelings that came up, able to integrate a lot of that old hurts. And it was a process along the way. And I think a big thing about self love is being patient with the process, because, when I talk about forgiveness in the book, I talk about like chipping away with a chisel at the massive stone rolled in front of the tomb of your heart. So if you've been through a lot of hurt and a lot of hurting situations, and you picked up a shame story along the way, then it's going to take, some dedication and time to get to that place where you can finally, open that door to your heart again, um,
Yeah.
and
Wow.
reconnect with
Because
yourself.
I know for last time we were talking, you brought up, how last year was really the moment when you felt you actually, have you've been able to practice self-love, and you met that mark last year. So for you, like, what kinds of things did you practice or start doing to learn self-love?
Well, part of it is definitely, like I said, kind of like shining a light into the shame, because shame is just this story that I'm not good enough, I'm never good enough, and it's hard to love yourself if you are even bought into that belief at all. It's always going to kind of, uh, dirty your vision a little bit about who you are. And I think the more you get to know yourself, so even by doing any kind of emotional work, the inside job, whatever you want to call it, the more you get to know yourself more intimately, the more you love yourself, which is at the same time, the more like you really see everyone else for who they are. And, you just want them to have that same experience that you have, because, uh, you know, it's like, how can you not want to give that away when you truly like fall back in love with yourself?
Yeah, especially like when you talk about the fact that you've been able to reach that point, and why would you not want to share with other people how that's possible to get there? Because I know we also brought up, when you're in that place in your life when it's very hard and almost feels impossible to
Mm-hmm.
practice self-love because you're so used to being more critical and more judgmental and carrying that shame, like you said, associated with whatever event happened, whatever story it was, whatever it was, associating that so strongly to the point where you don't even think you can really care about yourself anymore, and you kind of just start to spiral into this place and stay stuck in that. But then when you started doing those things, like you said, shining the light on the shame and realizing what that story was and how it was keeping you where you were, how it was keeping you stuck, how it was keeping you from moving forward and having a good experience, having a good time, and really enjoying your life. And once you started to see that and become aware of that, I think is a huge piece of it too, because a lot of the times, when you are in that moment, you don't really notice it until you start to do the work, until later. And for you, I know, especially with writing this book, and I'd love to hear kind of like what was the process like for you in putting all of these pieces together and talking about all these different topics related to mental health. What was that like?
So like the actual creative process of the book.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I'd been like writing the book in a lot of ways for a long time. Um, and that's what one of my coworkers said that's read the book and was reading it a second time. He's like, it's like a lot of, because some of it's stuff that I say a lot, and it's kind of like my messages, like you said, what messages was I trying to convey? Um, and self-love is absolutely one of them because I believe all people are worthy of love. I think some people are sicker than others, and maybe there are some bad people, but I've only met really sick people. I haven't met people who are all the way bad. I don't believe in defective humans. I believe in defective conditioning that makes us that way,
Mm-hmm.
and um, that helps a lot with forgiveness too. But the process for the book, let me get back on track there because I kind of went back to an earlier question. Um, I tried to write from a space of presence as much as possible. Like I said, some of that stuff were things that I've taught on for a while, so I already had within me. But then a lot of the metaphors that I wrote were just kind of like following the pen, like a stream of consciousness almost, and I wrote it all by hand. And then I went,
Wow.
and
Wow.
then going back and like trying to put it in order and all that sort of thing. Um, and I knew certain topics I wanted to touch on, like trauma, addiction, recovery, stuff that, I knew I wanted to touch on sadness and that sort of stuff. But I didn't know all the topics, and some of them just kind of came to me while I was writing it. Like I didn't know I was going to write about creativity, and maybe it's because I was doing something creative. Um, I didn't know I was going to write about diversity and collective trauma, but then George Floyd was killed, and it was just there, and I was writing the book at the time. Um, and I don't think I could have written any of it had I not got to that place where I loved myself, because then it's like, again, like you just want to share that with everybody, and you believe, and that who you are is being yourself is the best you that you can ever be. And like cognitively, like I talked about before, like I knew that, but it was a process fully getting there, connecting
Yeah.
the head and the
Wow.
heart.
Of course. I feel like, especially that the whole process that you outlined, the whole creative process of doing that and writing the book, and, the things that you wrote about that you didn't think you were going to, and you didn't think you were going to include. But I like how we also talked a little bit about vulnerability and the power of that. So I think I remember asking you, of all the chapters, which one was, you know, like something about, affected you the most, or maybe you were most like afraid of getting into or experiencing that feeling. And I remember you bringing up sadness and talking a little bit about that and how, what that was like dealing with that at the point you were in your life. So you brought up sadness. So what about sadness made you terrified at that point in your life, or, you know, feel shameful about discussing that?
Yeah, I mean, somewhere along the way, my limbic brain got the interpretation that to be sad is to be weak, is to be pathetic. Vulnerability was, and, there was adverse life events. I suffered some abuse as a child. And I think anything that I thought might make me look or seem weak, um, I had to hide behind the ego, and I had to I had to do whatever I could to suppress that part of me, that sad kid inside me.
Yeah. So what was that like when you actually dealt with it? Because I remember you talking about, you know, suppressing that, you know, covering that with other things, not dealing with it, pushing it back, or pushing it so out of focus that you didn't even really think about it as much. So what was it like when you actually dealt with that?
I think it was, it's weird because, I mean, it's not weird, but when I talk about the inner child stuff, I talk about how the child's initially, sad, and then scared, and then angry, and then eventually just lost and sick. And that was kind of like the progression for me to that point. And I can look back in my younger years in active addiction, and I had a pretty spiritual woman. I told her she recognized the anger in me, but then she informed me that I was enraged, and it was true. I was just going around enraged all the time. But underneath all that, was fear, and underneath that fear was sadness. And a lot of the recovery process is uncovering a lot of how these fears or these negative core beliefs were driving my behaviors. Because I didn't just put down the substance and get better. Those fears were still there, and I still had to discover and meet them and walk through them. And then I found out that one of the biggest fears I had was to allow myself to feel the sadness that was underneath it all. And again, like, that's a big part of the self forgiveness, is to what I was incapable, you know, of meeting at the time. Now that I am able to, allowing myself to feel that and to heal. And that's why that part of the book was powerful for me, because in the last few years in therapy, I've gotten a lot better at allowing, when the sadness comes up, to actually just feel it instead of putting that guard up. I mean, I had friends that would tell me, like, I wish I cried like Kevin. It's like really cool because, it's like a kind of like a Clint Eastwood, just a single tear falling down my face. But that was because I wasn't allowing those like gates to open. And I'm a sensitive person, and now I'm actually grateful for that, because I wouldn't be able to write this book. I wouldn't be able to help people the way that I can. Um,
Yeah.
you know,
I love how you bring up the point of actually feeling that feeling that you were so afraid of and had suppressed for so long, because, you know, you were spending so much time covering that up with things and like piling on to not feel it, to not experience it. But then, you know, when you really talk about once you did feel that sadness and feel those emotions that you didn't want to, you know, relive that experience and go through that. And you wanted just to, you know, try to move on. But, you know, the more you continued to just pile things on, bury it, it actually got worse. And you were talking about how people were noticing, you know, how angry you were and things like that. And you know, and just kind of reflecting on that and feeling like, you know, just your experience, like not knowing where that's coming from, but at the same time, knowing you, just the fear of feeling that emotion and what that brings out in you in your life and how you react to people is is crazy to me to kind of get into, because I feel like it almost seems, you know, so obvious and easy, like an easy simple answer, you know, just feel
yeah,
this and it's fine, it's right there. But yeah, it's not at the time, and just kind of going through that process. But another thing I really liked about you and your story when we were talking is you told me, when you got sober, one of the jails you were telling me that you were in and you were detoxing in or spent time in, you actually went back there and were working there. So that's something I thought was really cool, because that's kind of how we related too on that level. And, talking to you about, what is crooked illness? What does it mean? And kind of, my experience with being hospitalized and then going back and working in a clinic where I was a patient. So I would love to know from you, like, kind of, what did you get out of that experience? Or like, what did that teach you anything you know, from both perspectives?
I mean, definitely. Firstly, I didn't work there. I volunteered there
Oh,
for
okay.
like
Okay.
for a long time, um, in the recovery aspect. But it was yeah, extremely. I mean, it kept me really grateful because it would remind me of where I came from every time I stepped in there. I mean, I had worn the green jumpsuits and the little blue shoes, and um, I knew. I mean, I can even just think talking about it now, I can almost smell that like acrid jail air. Anyone that's been in jail knows what I'm talking about. Um, so it really kept it green for me, um, which can be extremely valuable in recovery because sometimes when we get far away from our past, we start to forget it. And I think it helped me kind of like, because there's some hurt that you don't want to forget, you know. I don't want to
Yeah.
suffer. You don't want to suffer needlessly from it, but I don't want to ever have to go through that stuff ever again. And at the same time, it also gave people listen to me when I was in there, because they knew I'd been literally like in their shoes and had made a had found hope and found a way out just by doing what I was told to do. Really,
Yeah, and I think that's actually really amazing, the fact that you were there and you spent time there yourself. You were in jail and then you went back and volunteered and worked with people and were serving them, and just being able to realize what you overcame and what you like, the things that you went through and the struggles that you experienced, how you were able to overcome that. So I would love to ask you, if you had advice for someone who was wanting to learn how to forgive themselves, what would you tell them?
well, I would say that number one, it's a practice. Number two, like forgiveness, and I mentioned in the book, but it's like there's this magical two-way street to it. So if like you did something to me and screwed me over, hurt me, uh, and I found a way to forgive you, it would help me forgive that the stuff inside of me. As I forgive more stuff inside of me, I become better at forgiving you, and I just the more you kind of practice that, and show yourself grace, and try to like understand people, it doesn't. And again, that doesn't justify why someone does something like. But then all of a sudden, I understand like this person was just really sick, you know, and I think as you practice it, you just get better at it, and it can start with small stuff like the perfectionism. Oh, you forgot to sign your name before you faxed this report over to a probation officer or something. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And just learning how to let yourself off the hook with that kind of stuff. Um, I was listening to one of your podcasts, and you were talking about making little changes. So that's it. Sometimes it's the little forgiveness, and it kind of gets your forgiveness muscle stronger so that you can start to forgive the bigger things.
Yeah, and I think that's so important to bring that up, that you just said to do small pieces, right? And not to think that you need to make these huge, crazy, wild changes right now to your life today. And it's, start with these things and take these steps and, practice these things. And like you said, it is, really is a practice. It's something that you do each day. And like anything else, so, like when you're learning something or trying to grow in a certain way and certain area of your life, it's going to take time. But once you get that, gist of it down, you start to notice the effects in your life, how you're able to forgive other people and then forgive yourself. And it's almost like this cycle that you start to develop and see yourself in, instead of the one before, that you're trying to get away from, that was where you weren't able to practice compassion for yourself or to have grace or forgiveness for anything, and just kind of being stuck. But then noticing over time these small things that are going on, that are changing and just occurring because you took those small steps. And I think that's a huge piece of it, that you don't need to just dive
Journey.
into
Yeah.
into
The
something
journey,
right now. Yeah.
yeah. It's not a destination. It's a journey that we're on. And yeah, it's not it's a marathon and not a sprint if it's any kind of
Mm-hmm.
race. It's being human.
Oh, yes. So for you, like, if you could tell me right now one thing, the biggest thing that you've learned throughout your entire life, journey, book, everything, like what would that biggest thing be?
Wow. Um,
That's a question you were like, what? Didn't expect this.
yeah, I mean the book process was really powerful because through it, I think I fully got to the place where I trust myself completely, which is something a lot of mentors have taught me to do. They're always like, "What does your gut say? What does your gut say?" Um, Dr. Dyer, he used to say in his books, like, disregard the good opinion of others. So when you're editing a book, especially one that doesn't have perfect English, and you're running it by different people and they have different editorial styles, some of it you have to be like, okay, that's constructive criticism I should take. But this is something I know that I want it this way, exactly how it is, on purpose, because it came from like this intentional place.
Yeah. And I love how
So
you talk about the book and kind of how that for you has given you trust in yourself, and trusting yourself in, being able to put that out there, to put these messages, to do, just to do the thing. You wrote a book. That's a big deal. I'm working on one. I'm working on running right. I haven't written it yet, but I'm working on it. But you did it. You put it out there, you have your message, and it's powerful, and the messages in there relate not only to your life, but to whoever's picking it up and checking it out, reading it, and seeing, what's going on within each chapter and all of that. So, and I think it's a huge thing to get into, the power of what it does when you're able to learn forgiveness, practice forgiveness, forgiveness for yourself, forgiveness for others, forgiveness just in general. So, I'm so glad that we got to connect. You reached out to me with the book and all of it, and I was super excited to check it out and to see the messages and just to chat with you and really hear, your experience, the things that you went through, with recovery and addiction, and being in jail and then going back and volunteering and being a therapist, and all this stuff that's going on, and all the things you learned from these things. And that's really what I honestly enjoy most about every conversation I have with everybody who comes on here, is just kind of like, what did you learn from this? What did
yeah,
this teach you? And I really loved, hearing that message from you, and being able just to virtually sit down and chat with you. So thank you so much,
absolutely.
Kevin. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. And to everyone listening, I hope you guys really enjoyed this message today and Kevin's story, and learning about, more about the power of forgiveness, and hopefully can apply some of this stuff into your life or someone else who you may know who could use this message. So I hope you guys have a great rest of your day, great rest of your night, and hope you guys enjoyed this episode. And I'm going to end that on this note, say goodbye to you guys, and say goodbye. Bye, Kevin.
Bye.